In the summer of 2021, a woman parked her car at a trailhead in the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming and went for a 3-hour hike. She left nothing in the vehicle. No food, no cooler, no wrappers, no crumbs. She was careful about this because she had been careful about this for years, having grown up in bear country, and absorbed the foundational lesson that bears and food-scented vehicles are a combination with predictable consequences. If what you just heard makes you want to keep going, stay here. This is exactly the kind of content we make, and there is a lot more of it. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. When she returned to the trailhead, she found her car with the rear passenger door torn completely off its frame. The door was lying in the gravel 15 feet from the vehicle. The interior had been methodically searched. The seat cushions were displaced. The glove compartment had been opened and its contents scattered across the floor. A water bottle was punctured. A rain jacket had been dragged out and left in the dirt beside the door. Nothing edible had been inside the car. Nothing edible had been found by the bear. The search had been thorough and apparently systematic, and it had produced nothing, and the bear had left. The damage estimate was over $4,000. The woman filed a report with the Forest Service and was told, with the practiced patience of rangers who have explained this many times, that grizzly bears break into vehicles for reasons that go considerably beyond the presence of actual food. She had done everything right. She was not the problem. The bear had detected something she could not smell, something she could not see, something that had crossed a threshold in the bear's memory and triggered a response she had no way to anticipate or prevent. This is the part of the story that does not fit neatly into the public understanding of why bears break into cars. The public understanding is simple and wrong in ways that matter. Bears smell food. Bears go to food. Bears destroy property to reach food. The solution is to not leave food in your car. This understanding is not false exactly. It is a massive oversimplification of what is actually happening inside the sensory and cognitive architecture of the animal standing next to your door before it decides to remove that door from the vehicle. If that story made you want to understand what is actually going on inside a grizzly bear's nose and memory, stay with this, because the answer is stranger and more unsettling than most people expect, and it has consequences for how humans and grizzly bears are going to share landscapes over the next several decades that nobody is fully prepared for. The grizzly bear's nose is the beginning of this story, and it is worth spending real time on what that nose actually is, because the casual description of bears having a good sense of smell does not come close to capturing the biological reality. Grizzly bears possess somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 individual scent receptors in their nasal epithelium. Humans have roughly 5 to 6 million olfactory receptor neurons. Grizzly bears have an estimated 300 million. The comparison is almost meaningless in terms of lived sensory experience because the difference is not merely quantitative. It is architectural. The olfactory bulb of a grizzly bear, the neural structure that processes scent information before passing it to the rest of the brain, is proportionally 5 times larger relative to total brain size than the olfactory bulb of a human being. The grizzly is not smelling the same world as a human and smelling it more clearly. It is processing olfactory information in a fundamentally different way, with a system that has no real human analog, that organizes reality around scent in the same way human cognition organizes reality around vision. What this means practically is that a grizzly bear approaching a parked vehicle in a trailhead parking lot is not looking at the car the way a human looks at a car. It is reading the car. It is reading a text composed entirely of chemical information, a document that is layered in time, because scent persists and degrades at different rates depending on the compound, the temperature, the humidity, and the substrate on which it was deposited. The bear is not just detecting what is in the car right now. It is detecting the chemical history of the car. What was in it yesterday? What was in it 2 weeks ago? What the person who drives it regularly eats for breakfast, whether they have a dog, whether they smoke, whether they wear synthetic or natural fiber clothing, whether a child sits in the back seat, and whether that child recently ate a granola bar. Not today, not this week, perhaps not this month, but recently enough that volatile organic compounds from that granola bar are still present in the upholstery at concentrations detectable to an animal with this sensory apparatus. This is not a theoretical extrapolation. This is what the behavioral and forensic evidence from thousands of vehicle break-in incidents in bear country consistently shows. Parks and wildlife agencies in Yellowstone, Grand Teton, Glacier, and the Canadian national parks where grizzly bears are present in significant numbers have documented cases in which vehicles with zero current food contents were broken into, while adjacent vehicles in the same parking lot with food inside were not touched. The pattern, which initially seems inexplicable from the food-in-car equals bear breaks-in framework, makes complete sense when you understand that the bear is not responding to the presence of food. It is responding to a chemical signature that, in its experience and memory, is associated with food. The distinction is not academic. It is the entire mechanism. The concept of odor memory in grizzly bears is where the science gets genuinely remarkable, and where the popular understanding of what bears can detect has been running years behind the research. Bears have long been known to have strong associative memories, the ability to connect a specific stimulus with a specific outcome in a way that persists over time. This is not unusual among large mammals. What is unusual about grizzly bears is the apparent precision and longevity of olfactory associative memories specifically, and the degree to which those memories appear to operate as templates that drive behavior in the absence of the original stimulus. In practical terms, this means that a grizzly bear that has previously had a rewarding food experience associated with a specific complex odor profile does not need the food to be present to be triggered by that odor profile. The smell of the container, the fabric, the person, the vehicle type, or even a component chemical from a previous food encounter can activate a learned motivational state that produces the same investigative behavior the food itself would have produced. Researchers studying grizzly bear cognition have noted that this is qualitatively different from simple Pavlovian conditioning in the way it appears to operate in practice. A conditioned response in a classically conditioned animal is typically triggered by a stimulus that closely matches the original conditioning stimulus. What grizzly bears appear to be doing is something more flexible and, in some ways, more sophisticated. They appear to be capable of generalization across odor categories in a way that allows them to detect partial matches, components of a remembered scent profile rather than the whole profile, and still activate the full investigative behavioral sequence. A bear that was rewarded for investigating a vehicle that contained beef jerky is not simply looking for beef jerky. It is looking for anything in the chemical landscape that contains compounds it associates with the categories of rewarding smells it has encountered before. And because the chemistry of food odors overlaps substantially with the chemistry of food-associated human odors, specifically the odors of food on hands, food residue in fabric, food packaging, even after the food is removed, the bear's search image is extraordinarily broad. The practical consequence is that virtually any vehicle driven by humans who have eaten food in the past several weeks is, to a grizzly bear with relevant experience, a potential target, not because it definitely contains food, because it contains a chemical signature that the bear's memory classifies in a category that has previously contained food. The bear is working from a learned probability distribution, not from a confirmed detection of a specific caloric reward. It is making a prediction based on past experience, and its sensory system is so sensitive that the inputs driving that prediction are invisible and undetectable to the humans whose property is being assessed. The car break-in data from the major national parks makes this point with a specificity that is instructive. Yellowstone National Park maintains detailed records of vehicle break-ins by bears, both grizzly and black bear, that have accumulated over decades. The records show patterns that are not consistent with a simple food-present explanation. Rental cars are broken into at higher rates than personally owned vehicles driven by regular park visitors. The explanation that wildlife managers offer for this, and it is a compelling one, is that rental cars are driven by rotating populations of tourists who eat in their cars routinely, leave food residue in the upholstery and carpeting, and return the vehicles to a fleet that is cleaned but not chemically stripped of the volatile compounds that accumulate from weeks and months of food-adjacent use. The bear does not know it is a rental car. The bear knows that the vehicle is producing a chemical signature that, in aggregate, resembles the signature of many food-associated environments it has encountered before. The car is triggering the bear's learned food search behavior, even though there is no food in it, because the bear is not searching for food. It is searching for the class of environment in which food has previously been found. This distinction between searching for food and searching for food-predictive environments is the conceptual key to understanding why the standard advice about not leaving food in your car is necessary but not sufficient. It is necessary because actual food in a car dramatically increases the intensity of the chemical signal and confirms the bear's prediction in real time. It is not sufficient because the car that has never had food in it during this trip may still carry a substantial chemical history that qualifies it as a food-predictive environment in the bear's learned classification system. Solving the immediate problem of reward confirmation does not solve the deeper problem of what the bear's sensory memory is detecting and responding to. The memory component of this system is the part that has received the least public attention and the most research interest in recent years, and for good reason. The question of how long a grizzly bear retains learned odor associations and under what conditions those associations are expressed as behavior is not a settled scientific question. What the available evidence suggests is unsettling from a management perspective. Field studies tracking individual grizzly bears with GPS collars and behavioral monitoring have documented animals returning to specific sites, including specific vehicles or vehicle locations, across intervals measured in months and years. A bear that had a rewarding experience at a particular trailhead parking lot on a previous occasion will demonstrate site-specific behavior at that location in subsequent seasons. It will linger. It will investigate vehicles with more focus than it investigates vehicles in novel locations. It will approach with a purposefulness that behavioral researchers describe as consistent with the expression of a stored expectation rather than opportunistic novelty investigation. The bear is not just wandering and happening to check cars. It is going somewhere it expects to find what it is looking for, because it has been there before and been right before. The seasonal dimension of this memory expression is particularly interesting because it intersects with the physiological state that defines much of the grizzly bear's behavioral calendar. Hyperphagia is the late summer and fall period during which grizzly bears consume as many calories as possible in preparation for denning. During hyperphagia, a grizzly bear needs to consume between 15,000 and 20,000 calories per day. The urgency of this caloric demand produces a behavioral state that wildlife researchers describe as hyperphagia-driven food searching, in which the animal's motivational systems are oriented almost entirely toward caloric acquisition, and in which thresholds for investigating food-predictive stimuli drop dramatically. A bear in hyperphagia that detects a vehicle odor profile it has learned to associate with food reward is operating under a different cost-benefit calculation than the same bear in spring. The caloric pressure is more intense, the behavioral inhibition on approaching human structures is lower, and the persistence of investigative behavior in the face of non-reward is greater. A hyperphagic bear will work longer and harder on a vehicle that has not yet produced a reward than the same bear would in May, because the motivational intensity of the caloric drive amplifies the learned search behavior in proportion to the animal's physiological need. This is reflected clearly in the seasonal distribution of vehicle break-in incidents in the major national parks. The peak of bear vehicle break-ins does not correspond to the season of highest park visitation, which is July and early August. It corresponds to the late August through October window of hyperphagia, when visitation is somewhat lower, but the bears are operating in the behavioral mode of maximum caloric urgency. The bears during this period are investigating more potential food sources with more intensity than at any other time of year, and the learned odor associations that have been building across a lifetime of food-searching experience are being expressed at maximum activation. A vehicle that sits in a trailhead parking lot in September in Grizzly country is being assessed by animals operating at a level of sensory and motivational engagement that has no precise human analog, and the assessment is being conducted with a sensory system that makes human olfaction look categorically impoverished. The individual variation in vehicle targeting behavior among grizzly bears is a dimension that wildlife managers have been grappling with for years, and that the public understanding of the problem almost entirely misses. Not all grizzly bears in a given area break into cars. Not all bears that have broken into cars continue to do so. The behavior tends to be highly individual and highly persistent in the individuals that develop it. A bear management record from the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem documents individual bears that are responsible for dozens of vehicle break-ins across multiple years, while other bears of similar age, sex, and range overlap with the same parking areas, produce no break-in incidents at all. The variation points to something about the specific experiential history of individual animals, the particular sequence of reward and reinforcement that has built a specific learned behavior in certain bears and not others. The initial learning event, the first time a young bear discovers that investigating a vehicle produces a food reward, appears to be disproportionately important in setting the trajectory of subsequent behavior. Bears are not born knowing that cars contain food. They learn this, either through their own discovery or through observation of their mothers or other bears demonstrating the behavior. The mother-mediated transmission of car-raiding behavior is documented in grizzly populations and represents one of the most behaviorally significant aspects of the problem from a management perspective. A bear that learns from its mother that vehicles are food-predictive environments will be learning this during the most sensitive developmental period for behavioral imprinting, will have many years of subsequent experience to reinforce and elaborate the learned association, and may subsequently transmit the behavior to her own offspring. The cultural transmission of vehicle targeting behavior within family lineages has been tracked in GPS-collared populations in specific study areas, and the pattern is consistent with observational learning producing lineage-specific behavioral traditions of the kind that have been documented in other large mammal populations, particularly cetaceans and primates. This transmission pathway has significant consequences for the trajectory of the problem in areas where the initial learning events have already occurred. In a population where no individual bears have learned that cars contain food, the problem does not exist. In a population where a small number of individuals have made the initial discovery and been rewarded, the problem has seeded itself and will grow through transmission and reinforcement at a rate that management, by lethal removal of individual problem bears, may not be able to keep pace with. The Greater Yellowstone grizzly population, which has grown from fewer than 150 individuals in the 1970s to an estimated 700 to 1,000 animals today, contains a substantial and growing cohort of bears, with learned food predictive associations with human vehicles and structures. The management pressure from lethal removal of confirmed food-conditioned bears has not eliminated the learned behavior from the population. It has not eliminated it because the conditions that produced the initial learning events, the presence of improperly stored food, the residual chemical signatures of decades of food-associated human activity in specific areas, the proximity of bears and humans in a landscape that is functioning as a food-rich environment for bears, regardless of intentional human food storage choices, have not been eliminated. The chemistry of what the bear is actually detecting when it targets a vehicle that the human owner believes is food-free is worth examining in some detail, because it illuminates why the problem is so much harder to solve than the simple "leave no food behind" framework suggests. Human food generates volatile organic compounds at every stage of its interaction with human environments. When a person eats a sandwich in a car, the volatile compounds from that sandwich are not confined to the sandwich. They disperse into the air inside the vehicle, absorb to the fabric of the seats and headliner, absorb into the porous materials of the dashboard and carpet padding, and persist in those materials at concentrations that decrease over time, but do not reach zero on any timescale relevant to normal vehicle turnover cycles. The compounds include short-chain fatty acids from any food with fat content, which persist in fabric for extended periods, and which bears are extraordinarily sensitive to. They include sugar-associated Maillard reaction products from any cooked or processed food, which have characteristic volatile signatures that bears have demonstrated the ability to detect at extremely low concentrations in controlled experimental settings. They include protein degradation products that have a distribution across essentially all foods of animal origin and many of plant origin. They include packaging-specific compounds from the plastics, foils, and cardboard materials that virtually all modern food is purchased and transported in. Compounds that persist on surfaces long after the packaging itself has been removed. The accumulation of these compounds in a vehicle over months and years of normal use by people who eat food, which is all people, produces a chemical profile that is in some respects more food-associated than a vehicle that happens to contain one specific food item during a single visit. A car that has never had a meal eaten in it, but has been driven by the same family to a grocery store every week for 2 years, carries a substantial and layered chemical history of every food that has been transported in it. Every person who has sat in it after eating, every bag that has dripped or leaked or simply transferred volatile compounds to the upholstery through contact. The bear's nose is reading this entire history, not just the present moment, and its memory is interpreting that history through the framework of everything it has previously learned about what car smell means. The lip balm problem deserves its own treatment, because it illustrates the breadth of the sensory challenge in a way that has practical immediacy for people who spend time in bear country. Wildlife managers in the national parks have documented cases in which bears targeted vehicles, packs, and personal items that contained cosmetic products, specifically lip balms, lotions, and sunscreens that used food-derived compounds in their formulation. The organic chemistry of many cosmetic products overlaps substantially with the organic chemistry of food. Fruity lip balms, vanilla-scented sunscreens, coconut oil-containing moisturizers, all of these products produce volatile compounds that, to a bear, with no conceptual distinction between cosmetic product and food, are indistinguishable from or associated with the foods they are derived from or designed to smell like. A vehicle that contains a lip balm in the center console, or a sunscreen in the glove compartment, or a lotion in the door pocket, is a vehicle that is producing a food-associated chemical signal to any bear with enough experience to have built the relevant associations. The human who left these items in the car did not leave food in the car. The bear's sensory system does not make the distinction. The same logic applies to a range of non-food items that produce chemically complex odor signatures from food-derived compounds. Natural fiber clothing that has been washed with detergents containing plant-derived fragrances. Rubber materials that use certain processing compounds. Leather seats treated with conditioners derived from animal fat. Even the CO2 in a sealed food container, which escapes slowly through any non-hermetic seal and carries trace compounds from the food's volatile profile, is detectable by a bear at concentrations far below any threshold that would register as a smell to a human. The car that a person believes is completely food-free because they have never eaten in it and never stored food in it is still, from the bear's olfactory perspective, a complex chemical document that may contain dozens of food-associated signals depending on the history of its manufacture, the materials used in its interior, and the personal care products used by its occupants. The behavioral persistence of car-breaking bears, once they have initiated the behavior, is the dimension that most directly determines the management challenge and the hazard profile for humans who park in bear country. A bear that has broken into a vehicle and been rewarded, even once, has had an experience that the neurological machinery of reinforcement learning processes in a way that makes the behavior extremely resistant to extinction. The reinforcement is powerful. The food reward is exactly what the bear's evolved motivational systems are designed to find, and the association between the behavior and the reward has been confirmed in real time. Subsequent investigations that do not produce a reward do not rapidly extinguish the behavior because the bear is not receiving a clear negative signal that says, "This class of environment no longer contains food." It is receiving an ambiguous signal that says, "This specific vehicle, on this specific occasion, did not contain food," which is different information. The category remains rewarded even when specific instances are not, and the bear continues to sample the category with a persistence driven by the partial reinforcement schedule that real-world food searching produces. Partial reinforcement, the condition in which a behavior is rewarded on some occasions but not others, is the condition under which learned behaviors are most resistant to extinction. It is also the condition that characterizes the actual reward structure of vehicle investigation by grizzly bears in areas of high human traffic. Some cars have food, some have food residue, some have food-associated products, some have nothing that confirms the bear's prediction. The variable ratio of reward to non-reward is exactly the reinforcement schedule that behavioral researchers have long known produces the most durable learned behaviors in virtually every species that has been studied. The car-raiding bear is locked into an extraordinarily persistent behavioral pattern, not despite the fact that it is sometimes wrong, but partly because it is sometimes wrong. The unpredictability of the reward is part of what makes the behavior so hard to stop. The management tools available to wildlife agencies attempting to reduce vehicle break-ins in grizzly bear areas are a mix of the moderately effective and the deeply inadequate. Bear spray, which is an effective deterrent in direct bear encounters, does not protect parked vehicles. Electric fencing, which is highly effective for protecting campsites and food storage installations, is not deployable at scale in trailhead parking lots. The bear-resistant food storage containers that are mandatory in most Grizzly Bear National Park backcountry areas address the problem of properly stored food in camps, but do not address the problem of food-associated chemical signatures in vehicles. Hazing of individual problem, bears using rubber bullets, noise deterrents, and other aversive conditioning tools has produced mixed results in field conditions. with success rates that vary substantially across individual animals, and that appear to be lowest in the animals with the strongest learned food associations. Precisely the bears that pose the highest risk. The emerging field of aversive conditioning, specifically targeting vehicle-associated behavior, represents one of the more promising management approaches, but also one of the least systematically implemented. The principle is straightforward. A bear that approaches a vehicle receives a strong negative stimulus at the moment of or immediately before contact with the vehicle. The negative stimulus creates a learned association between vehicle approach and aversive experience that competes with the existing learned association between vehicle approach and food reward. The challenge is operational. The negative stimulus must be delivered with precise timing relative to the behavior to produce the intended association. It must be delivered consistently across many exposures to build an association strong enough to compete with the existing reward association. It must be delivered by means that do not habituate the bear to the aversive stimulus itself. And it must be delivered without creating a secondary association between human presence, as opposed to vehicle presence, and the aversive stimulus. Because the goal is to make the vehicle aversive, not to make humans aversive to an animal that will continue to live in proximity to humans for the rest of its life. Some park management programs have experimented with instrumented vehicles that deliver aversive stimuli automatically when a bear makes contact, essentially creating self-protecting decoy vehicles that train approaching bears without requiring a human ranger to be present at the moment of contact. The operational results from these programs are encouraging in specific contexts, but have not been implemented systematically enough to generate the population-level data that would allow confident evaluation of their effectiveness at scale. The problem is partly one of resources. Systematic, aversive conditioning of individual bears at the population level requires personnel, equipment, and sustained commitment that most wildlife management agencies operating in the current budget environment cannot consistently maintain. The result is a management landscape characterized by reactive responses to specific problem animals rather than proactive behavioral conditioning across the population, which means that the learned behavior continues to spread through transmission and reward, while management efforts address its consequences case by case. The human behavior dimension of this problem is the one that generates the most frustration among wildlife managers who have spent careers watching people do preventable things in bear country. The frustration is not primarily about people leaving food in their cars, though that happens constantly and accounts for a substantial proportion of confirmed food reward events that reinforce vehicle targeting behavior. The frustration is about the broader pattern of choices that constitute the human side of the human-bear interaction in shared landscapes. Choices that reflect a genuine gap between what people understand about bear cognition and sensory capability and what actually governs bear behavior in the presence of human infrastructure. The tendency to underestimate what the bear can detect is the core cognitive error. People understand at an abstract level that bears have better noses than humans. They do not understand, in a practically operative way, what that means for their behavior. They remove their food from the car and conclude the car is no longer a target. They throw away a food wrapper in a parking lot trash can and conclude the food-associated scent trail they have left from their car to the trash can and back is negligible. They eat a meal at the trailhead before hiking and wash their hands in the restroom, and conclude the food compounds on their skin and in their exhaled breath are below any meaningful threshold. None of these conclusions is correct, and the gap between the conclusions and the reality is not a small gap. It is a gap measured in orders of magnitude of sensory sensitivity. The hand-washing study conducted by researchers affiliated with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife which examined bear responses to human hands washed with different soaps at varying intervals after food contact, found that bears could detect residual food-associated compounds on hands washed with standard soap and water up to 45 minutes after washing, and could detect them on hands washed with strongly scented soaps up to 20 minutes after washing. This is not a result about the bear detecting the soap. It is a result about the bear detecting the food compounds that persist beneath the soap in concentrations that the soap's masking effect does not reduce to below the bear's detection threshold. The person who has washed their hands after eating and handles their car door, their pack, their tent pole, their car keys, is depositing food-associated chemical information on every surface they touch, at concentrations they cannot perceive and would not believe were meaningful, that are meaningful to the animal conducting the assessment from 20 feet away in a parking lot. The implications of this for the advice that wildlife managers give to recreationists in bear country are significant and have not been fully integrated into the standard guidance that most people receive. The standard guidance focuses on food storage, on not leaving food in cars, on using bear-resistant containers for camp food. All of this guidance is correct and important and should continue to be given. What is missing is guidance that addresses the chemical legacy of food-associated human activity in the absence of the food itself. Guidance that acknowledges that the bear's target is not the food, but the learned category of food-predictive environment, and that this category is defined by sensory information that humans cannot assess for themselves, and therefore cannot reliably eliminate from the environments they create. The population dynamics of the greater Yellowstone grizzly bear population are a necessary context for understanding why the vehicle break-in problem is likely to get more complex before it gets simpler. The grizzly bear population in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem has been one of the great success stories of the Endangered Species Act. From a population low estimated at fewer than 150 individuals in the early 1970s, the population has grown to between 700 and 1,000 animals, occupying a range that has expanded significantly from the core of the recovery area. The recovery has been genuine, sustained, and ecologically significant. It has also produced a growing population of bears that are pressing against the edges of their historical range, dispersing into areas that have not had resident grizzly bears for generations, and encountering human infrastructure and human food sources in territories where neither the bears nor the people have had the experience to develop the mutual wariness that characterizes grizzly-human coexistence in long-established overlap zones. Young dispersing male grizzly bears are the demographic most likely to be involved in property damage incidents, including vehicle break-ins, for reasons that parallel the pattern in mountain lion encounters in some ways and diverge from it in others. Subadult male grizzly bears, those between 3 and 7 years old that have been displaced from their mother's territories and are moving through the landscape in search of their own home ranges, are physiologically immature animals operating in unfamiliar terrain, with less experience, less territorial establishment, and less established food knowledge than adult bears. They are exploring. They are food-searching with an urgency, driven by the need to accumulate enough caloric reserve to survive their first independent winters. They are encountering human infrastructure, including vehicles, campsites, garbage systems, and agricultural operations, at the moment in their lives when they are most receptive to new learning and most motivated to exploit novel food sources. A subadult male that finds a rewarding food item in or near a vehicle during this exploratory phase is building a learned association at the developmental moment when learned associations are most durably encoded, and he is building it in a context that he will carry with him for the next 20 or more years of his life. The range expansion of the greater Yellowstone grizzly population has been carrying these young dispersing males into areas where the human infrastructure is not designed for grizzly bear presence, where the people are not habituated to grizzly bear proximity, and where the management systems for addressing grizzly-human conflict are not built for the frequency and type of incidents that grizzly bear presence produces. The Front Range communities of Wyoming and Montana that have seen their first grizzly bears in generations over the past decade are not, in the main, equipped with the bear-aware infrastructure and culture that communities in the core recovery area have developed over 40 years of coexistence. They are encountering grizzly bears for the first time in living memory, and the grizzly bears are encountering them at the most food-motivated and learning-receptive moment of the bears' lives. The combination is producing learning events in bears and in humans that will shape the behavioral trajectory of individuals on both sides of the interaction for years. The whitebark pine collapse is a piece of the ecological context that does not get enough attention in popular accounts of grizzly bear behavior, and that is directly relevant to the vehicle break-in problem. Whitebark pine seeds have historically been one of the most important high-calorie fall food sources for grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. A mature whitebark pine cone contains seeds with a fat content of around 60%, making them among the most calorie-dense natural food items available to bears during hyperphagia. Whitebark pine forests across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have been devastated by white pine blister rust and mountain pine beetle, both of which have expanded dramatically due to warming winters that historically limited their range. The functional loss of whitebark pine as a food source in large portions of the bear's range has forced individual bears to compensate through alternative food sources, and the compensatory food-seeking behavior has produced increased rates of conflict with human food infrastructure in areas where the natural caloric compensation for whitebark pine loss is insufficient. A bear that is short of its caloric target entering denning season due to whitebark pine seed failure is a bear operating with a heightened motivational drive to investigate food-predictive environments. The environmental disruption driving the whitebark pine collapse is not creating vehicle-targeting behavior. It is amplifying the expression of vehicle-targeting behavior in bears that have the learned associations to produce it, by increasing the caloric urgency that lowers investigation thresholds and extends the persistence of food-seeking behavior. This is not a simple or linear story. Grizzly bears are not becoming car breakers because whitebark pine is declining. Grizzly bears with learned car-raiding behavior are expressing that behavior more intensely and more persistently under the caloric pressure created by whitebark pine decline, among other natural food fluctuations. The distinction matters for management because it points to the multi-layered causality of the problem. Addressing vehicle security, addressing bear hazing, addressing individual problem bear management, all of these are necessary and none of them is sufficient, because the conditions driving the amplification of the learned behavior are ecological and demographic, and in some dimensions are changing in directions that are outside the immediate control of wildlife management agencies. The Glacier National Park experience with vehicle break-ins is worth examining specifically because it represents the longest continuous record of documented incidents in a population of grizzly bears with consistently high human contact rates, and because the longitudinal data reveals patterns that are not visible in shorter-term or smaller-scale incident records. Glacier has maintained detailed vehicle break-in records since the late 1970s, encompassing thousands of incidents across more than 4 decades. The long record shows that the incidents are not randomly distributed across the bear population. They cluster around specific family lineages, specific habitat areas with high parking infrastructure density, and specific seasonal windows that correspond to the behavioral and physiological states described earlier. The record also shows that management interventions, specifically the progressive improvement of food storage requirements in front country areas and the aversive conditioning programs applied to individual high-incident bears, have had measurable effects on incident rates in specific areas and time windows without producing the sustained population-level reduction in incident frequency that would indicate the learned behavior was being successfully managed at the source, rather than suppressed in specific contexts. The Glacier data also shows something about the role of visitor behavior that is both instructive and sobering. Incident rates at specific trailhead parking areas correlate more strongly with visitor food handling practices than with bear density. Parking areas used primarily by experienced backcountry travelers with strong bear-aware practices produce lower incident rates than parking areas of similar size used primarily by front-country day visitors, with variable awareness of bear-safe food handling, even when the bear density in the surrounding terrain is similar. The bear's behavior is not uniform across this landscape. It is responsive to the difference in the chemical environment created by different human behavioral profiles. The implication is that visitor education and behavioral compliance are not peripheral issues in managing vehicle break-in risk. They are central to the mechanism of the problem in a way that current management communications do not always clearly convey. The question of what constitutes a food-associated odor that a grizzly bear can detect from a vehicle is one that has practical implications for anyone who spends time in bear country. And the answer, based on the available research, is both broader and more specific than most people realize. The obvious category, actual food and food containers, is well understood. The less obvious categories include the residues of food preparation that accumulate in a vehicle used for camping or extended outdoor recreation, the specific compounds from cooking that adsorb to clothing and equipment, the personal care product compounds already discussed, and a category that has been receiving more research attention in recent years, the odorants associated with human physiological states, including stress, exertion, and hormonal fluctuation. The stress odor dimension is speculative, but not fringe. Research in multiple species has documented that predators and large omnivores can detect volatile compounds associated with mammalian stress responses, specifically the compounds released in sweat under conditions of elevated cortisol and adrenaline. Whether grizzly bears are detecting these compounds from vehicle interiors and whether they have behavioral significance comparable to food-associated odors is not established in the literature. What is established is that the sensory capability for such detection exists, and that behavioral observations of grizzly bears in the field are not inconsistent with a sensitivity to human physiological state that goes beyond simple food odor detection. Bears that approach vehicles and people in some situations while avoiding similar vehicles and people in other situations, with no obvious external variable to explain the difference, may be responding to chemical differences in the human occupant's physiological state that are not visible to the human observers interpreting the incident. The question of what grizzly bears remember about specific vehicles, as opposed to vehicle odors in general, is one of the more fascinating and least resolved questions in the behavioral ecology of human-bear conflict. There is circumstantial evidence from GPS collar tracking data that individual grizzly bears return to specific locations associated with previous food rewards with a frequency and specificity that exceeds what would be expected from random or scent-following search behavior alone. Bears have been tracked making what appear to be directed movements to specific trailhead parking areas from distances of several kilometers, crossing terrain that contains equally accessible alternative foraging areas, in a pattern that is consistent with place memory, the ability to hold a representation of a specific location in memory and navigate toward it in the absence of current sensory input from that location. Place memory in grizzly bears has been well documented in other contexts. bears reliably return to specific berry patches, specific stream sections, during fish runs, specific ungulate migration corridors, across seasonal intervals of months and annual intervals of years. The spatial precision of these returns exceeds what could be produced by scent tracking alone and is consistent with a spatial memory system capable of holding detailed representations of specific locations and the resources associated with them. If this spatial memory extends to human infrastructure locations associated with food reward, and the behavioral evidence suggests it does, then the management challenge includes not just the problem of the specific chemical signals in vehicles, but the problem of the bears that have encoded specific parking areas as food site locations in their long-term spatial memory. These bears are not searching for food. They are going to a place they know, or believe, to contain food, and they are arriving with an expectation that drives investigative behavior independent of whether the current chemical evidence fully supports that expectation. The longevity of grizzly bears compounds this problem in a management context. A female grizzly bear in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem can live to 25 to 30 years. A bear that made its first successful vehicle raid at age 3 is a bear that may still be acting on that learned experience and expressing that learned behavior at age 25. The management record contains individual bears with histories of vehicle break-in incidents spanning more than a decade, animals that have been hazed, aversively conditioned, relocated, and occasionally temporarily live-trapped and released, and that have continued the behavior through all of these interventions because the learned association at the core of the behavior is built on a foundation of direct reward that management interventions have not been able to fully overwrite. Lethal removal of confirmed chronic problem bears resolves the specific individual's behavioral history, but does nothing to address the learned behavior in the animals that remain, including the adult offspring of chronic problem animals who may have learned the behavior through maternal example. The bear-proof vehicle is not a technology that currently exists in a commercially deployable form, and the reasons for its absence illuminate the scale of the challenge. A vehicle designed to be bear-resistant would need to address not just the structural vulnerability of car doors and windows to a bear's physical capabilities, which are substantial, but the chemical signature problem, the fact that the vehicle's material composition and surface chemistry produce a detectable food-associated odor profile regardless of whether food is physically present. No car manufacturer has produced, or to current knowledge is seriously developing, a vehicle with interior materials selected for their low food-associated, volatile emission profile and their resistance to adsorption of food-derived compounds. The economics of the problem do not support that development investment, given the scale of the affected market. The result is that the vehicle fleet operating in grizzly bear country is, from the bear's chemical perspective, a distributed array of food-predictive environments, and the management system operating around that fleet is attempting to modify bear behavior and human behavior at the margins of a structural problem that it does not have the tools to address at the source. What responsible coexistence with grizzly bears in the current and expanding landscape of human-bear overlap actually requires is a level of sensory and cognitive humility about what the animal is capable of that most people, even most people who spend significant time in bear country, have not yet developed. It requires understanding that the bear's nose is not just a better version of a human nose.